So we talked about combat in the war, and that's what the bell ringer was about, which we typed in Canvas chat, the AP paper 2. Hopefully you can get that done today. If not, that's okay. You can turn it in later. Uh, just make sure that you get the second section of your paper completed, which should be your Roman numeral 2. The notes for today will be about the impact of the war. So let's look at that, and this will be the last of the notes. And of course, one of the biggest impacts was the Holocaust. And that had been part of the Nazi program. And it just didn't include Jews. We often say 6 million Jews, but it included other groups of people as well. Other people from Eastern Germany, including gypsies, or not Eastern Germany, but Eastern Europe, and also people that were dissidents of some type that criticized the government, social democrats, socialists, eventually priests and ministers that objected to the Nazi policies, Jehovah's Witnesses. So a variety of other groups of people, but obviously the biggest block of them that made up the people that suffered from the Holocaust were Jews. The Polish Jewish community was probably the second one after Germans that came or suffered from the Holocaust. The invasion from Germany and Russia started that event, and of course there were some that tried to flee, but others not so much. In fact, the majority weren't able to. Jews moved into crowded city areas known as ghettos to be separated from the rest of the population, and there they suffered from a lack of resources, food, and water, because obviously the Germans did not care what was going to happen to them. And then between 41 and 44, the Nazis carried out a well-regulated statistical, logistical campaign in order to exterminate Jews. And there was plenty of evidence because the Germans kept a lot of records, and it was incredibly organized, especially through the SS. And they experimented with a number of ways in order to eliminate those that they did not want anymore. First, they tried, for instance, firing squads and other methods, but they decided it was too slow and too expensive, so they eventually settled on gas chambers. And they also used psychological methods, so that way there wouldn't be mass panic or possibly a rebellion that happened. For instance, when they were getting off the trains, they might play music, for instance, just to make it look like they're arriving in a train station or airport or something like that. They convinced them that the gas chambers were showers where they would be cleansed, and so on. Yes. In 1945, 90% of the pre-1939 Polish Jewish population had been destroyed. And like I said before, about 6 million altogether. This is still a matter of controversy to today because some of the death camps or concentration camps were located in Poland. If you call them Polish death camps, Polish people will become incredibly offended because they say this wasn't our stuff, this was the Germans. And that's true. However, there would be actually a considerable number of Poles that will help Jews escape, but there will also be more than a few Poles that will help the Nazis. And so that creates some controversy, particularly in Poland. The home front, of course, also saw a major impact. The German people ended up suffering, of course, in the long run, while propaganda tried to keep them enticed and enthusiastic as much as possible. It's obvious, especially after the bombing began, and as the Allies started to approach, that panic and desperation would ensue. The Nazis tried to keep people in line by threatening executions for people that fled, especially during the Battle of Britain, which we'll see in the film. And then in the end, it was clear that Hitler did not have any sympathy for the German people. He believed since they were losing that they perhaps deserved their fate. The French, in the meantime, France had been divided up into two sections, the north, which was controlled by the Nazis, and the south, which was set up by a puppet government known as the Vichy regime, which is spelled Vichy. The problem in France was, once again, by the end of the war, there'd be a huge resistance, the biggest, because obviously France has one of the biggest populations in Europe. On the other hand, though, there were a lot of collaborators, and there are varying degrees that which you collaborated. And this is the hard time they had after the war when they tried to prosecute people. is what is collaboration? Obviously, the people in charge of the Vichy government, like Pétain, was guilty of collaboration. But what about his secretary? What about someone who just held the door for a Nazi that was coming into a store? What about people that sold goods to the Nazis? I mean, if they came into your bakery and ordered bread, you obviously couldn't refuse them. So there are varying degrees to which this happened. And of course, the biggest target was with women. They were too friendly or flirted, or especially if they had a relationship with Nazis, then they would suffer incredible punishments. And when the government wasn't willing to do it, the people were. Mobs would often, for instance, women, for example, and they would shave their heads completely bald and try to write things on them so that way they would be remembered as traitors. But then there were a number of French that did help in the resistance, the Free French. And a number of them had fled along with the military leadership like Charles de Gaulle. Some of them remained back inside France and carried out guerrilla tactics against the Nazis in order to slow them down. In Great Britain, the centralization and power of the government grew considerably during World War II because they were constantly threatened with invasion during the Battle of Britain. So emergency powers were given to Parliament, particularly the cabinet and the Prime Minister. And because of this, though, Britain eventually was industrializing much faster and producing more war equipment than Germany by 1941. The Soviet Union suffered the most, where 16 million people were killed. In sections that had been taken over by the Nazis, there was active resistance. So obviously there were civilians involved as well. And of course, while the war is going on, the Allies are already thinking about what will happen once the war is finished. At first, Roosevelt and Charter prepare what is called the Atlantic Charter, leading up to theoretical peace that will happen after the war. However, that was one of their first mistakes, as they did not include the Soviet Union, which made the Soviets suspicious. So in 1943, in Tehran, Iran, the three big leaders would meet in order to talk about what would happen in Europe during the next year. Then eventually they also would meet again in Yalta and Potsdam. In Yalta, they encouraged the Russians to join in the fight in the Far East in the Pacific. And they talked about setting up a United Nations organization to replace the defunct League of Nations. And then, of course, in Potsdam, they decided to take Germany and divide it up into zones of influence, with France, Britain, and the United States getting one, which we generally refer to as the American section, and then the other side would be the Soviets in the East. But this, of course, would set the tone for the Cold War. There's already suspicion that started with the Atlantic Charter, and by the time the last conference happened at Potsdam, there was a feeling that, of course, the Soviets would never leave the territory that they invaded. So for the remainder of the period, make sure you work on that paper. And tomorrow we will start the film. If you're at home, of course, you'll be looking at those various websites that are listed on the assignment.